Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Friday, June 20th, 2025. First, friendship is often seen as a comforting bond, a source of solace during turbulent times, but in Ava's world, it becomes something far more strategic. Her connection with Nina transcends simple empathy, it evolves into an intricate dance of influence, power, and manipulation cloaked under the guise of concern. When the court awarded Michael full custody of the children, the decision left Willow emotionally gutted, a mother stripped of her maternal role and dignity. Nina, watching her daughter fall into despair, felt the ache of helplessness burn deeper than ever. What made it worse in her eyes was Drew, calculated, self-serving Drew, who wasted no time positioning himself as Willow's protector, confidant, and emotional anchor. Nina viewed his presence as a barrier, one that prevented Willow from reclaiming her autonomy, and she desperately wanted her daughter pulled back into her orbit. That's when Ava stepped in. Ava didn't offer tears or empty words of comfort. Instead, she provided clarity, her version of it. She peeled back the curtain on Drew's persona, pointing out his history of calculated moves, his penchant for rewriting his past to fit the image he wanted others to believe. To Ava, Drew wasn't just an opportunist, he was a man who thrived on exploiting fragile women like Willow, taking advantage of their lowest moments to secure his place in their lives. Ava laid out a simple truth for Nina: as long as Drew remained in Willow's life, Nina would always be relegated to the sidelines. She wouldn't just lose her daughter emotionally, she would lose her entirely. Ava's advice didn't come from a place of malice, at least not overtly. It came from experience, from instinct, from the unwavering belief that control was only achievable if one was willing to play the long game. With Ava's counsel, Nina began to change. Gone was the woman who begged for inclusion, who sought reconciliation through forgiveness and patience. She became calculated, quiet, observant. She gathered information like a surgeon preparing for an operation, precise, intentional, and cold. Ava encouraged her to use every tool at her disposal. Media connections, financial ties, remnants of influence from her days as Crimson's editor. Most importantly, Ava reminded Nina of her access to Sunny, a volatile yet powerful wild card who, if provoked correctly, could destabilize Drew's carefully curated image. Nina didn't need to destroy Drew overnight. She needed to plant seeds of doubt, small cracks in his public image that would eventually grow into fractures wide enough for Willow to see through. The whispers began innocently enough. Rumors about Drew's questionable business decisions, his proximity to unethical ventures, and his manipulation of sympathy to maintain influence started circulating in closed circles. Ava ensured these whispers were neither too loud nor too soft, just enough to create unease. Nina, coached by Ava, stayed deliberately distant from Willow, choosing silence over confrontation. Her absence became a mirror for Willow to examine her choices. No more unconditional support, no more soothing maternal presence. It was Ava's idea to weaponize silence, to use it not as punishment, but as a reminder of what Willow had lost and might never regain. This psychological vacuum, filled only by Drew's ever-tightening grip, became unbearable. Meanwhile, Ava maintained her facade, always present but never overstepping, always listening but never accusing. She positioned herself as the mutual acquaintance, the person who simply observed patterns and offered guidance when asked. Her subtle presence during family gatherings, casual run-ins at the hospital, and quiet conversations with Willow weren't coincidences. They were calculated. And each time Willow expressed doubt, Ava was ready, with a look, a gesture, a well-placed observation about Drew's shifting moods or inconsistent stories. These weren't direct attacks. They were invitations for Willow to reach her own conclusions. And Ava knew that was far more effective than confrontation. As Willow began to question the integrity of her new reality, she also began to remember the strength of her connection to Nina. The very absence that once felt suffocating now became a wound. Ava seized the moment, gently steering Willow back toward her mother, not with guilt, but with reminders of sacrifices made and love withheld not out of rejection, but preservation. She painted a picture of Nina not as a flawed woman, but as a grieving mother who had been silenced too long. Willow, already teetering on the edge of emotional exhaustion, found herself slipping further from Drew, no longer able to reconcile his control with the autonomy she once cherished. Nina watched all this unfold with a newfound steeliness. She no longer felt victimized by circumstance, she felt empowered by strategy. Ava had given her more than advice, she had given her a blueprint. And while Drew remained unaware of the web closing around him, Nina prepared for the final act. There would be no confrontation, no outburst. Only revelation. And when it came, Willow would be the one to walk away, not just from Drew, but from the version of herself that believed she needed rescuing. Ava, as always, remained in the background, unseen but omnipresent, satisfied with the knowledge that the Queen had reclaimed her power, and that she had been the architect all along. Second, their meeting wasn't marked by fireworks or grand gestures, but by something far more enduring, an unexpected moment of emotional alignment that neither Emma nor Gio saw coming. It began with a quiet afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavier with things left unsaid. Gio had arrived with his usual guarded demeanor, a practiced indifference that masked the storm within. Emma, perceptive as always, sensed that something deeper was stirring beneath his surface, especially when Dante brought up the subject of Joe's mother. What might have escalated into a defensive confrontation became, instead, a pause, one that Emma gently filled with her presence, her calm, and an unwavering attentiveness that invited honesty. That was the moment Gio allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had long tried to bury, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel the urge to push someone away. The conversation between the three of them slowly unfolded into something more personal, more profound. Dante, ever attempting to mend the cracks in their fractured bond, spoke candidly about his own failures, how he had missed so much of Joe's life, how guilt still gnawed at him. Emma stepped in. Not to interrupt, but to add a perspective that reshaped the dialogue. She shared her own complex relationship with her mother, the love and pain that often coexisted, and the realization that even the most well-meaning parents could cause lasting damage. Her vulnerability disarmed Gio, who found an unexpected solace in her words. Emma didn't speak to lecture, she spoke to connect. Through her, Gio began to see Dante not just as a man who had failed him, but as someone who was also learning how to love, fumbling in his own broken way. What followed was a gradual softening in Gio, catalyzed by Emma's presence. She had a way of grounding him, of anchoring his chaotic emotions without judgment. The walls he had built with such care over the years started to crack, not from force but from the gentle persistence of Emma's kindness. He began to talk more openly. Not just about his anger, but about his confusion, his longing, and his fear that he was doomed to repeat the same emotional patterns that had hurt him. Emma listened with a compassion that never felt performative. She didn't try to fix him. Instead, she made space for him to see that he didn't need to be fixed, only understood. That distinction meant everything to Gio. As days passed, their bond deepened in ways neither had anticipated. What started as shared understanding turned into quiet companionship. They found themselves seeking out moments together, long walks through the hospital gardens, shared coffee breaks, late-night texts that began with casual check-ins but often ended in heartfelt confessions. For Gio, these moments became a lifeline. He had never trusted easily, but with Emma, trust wasn't demanded, it was earned, built slowly with every act of quiet loyalty and every word that landed like balm on old wounds. Emma, too, was surprised by how safe she felt around Gio. He didn't require her to be anything other than herself, and in return, she offered him a sense of emotional clarity he hadn't known he needed. The shift between them wasn't sudden but unmistakable. Gio found himself smiling more often when Emma was near. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, how her presence made even the most difficult conversations feel bearable. She was no longer just the person who helped him face his past, she had become someone whose opinion mattered deeply, whose happiness began to affect his own. Emma, for her part, became increasingly aware of how much space Gio had begun to occupy in her heart. He was intense, yes, and complicated, but he was also honest in a way that drew her in. There was something deeply moving about the way he tried, every day, to be better than the version of himself he once was. Their relationship quietly evolved from friendship into something more intimate, though neither spoke it aloud. They didn't need to. The shift was felt in the way Gio reached for her hand when words failed him, or how Emma leaned into his shoulder when the world became too heavy. They existed in a rhythm of their own making, one built on mutual healing, emotional reciprocity, and unspoken affection. People around them began to notice the change, how Gio was more patient, more reflective. How Emma's eyes followed him across a room with a softness that hadn't been there before. Still, they resisted labels. For them, what they had was too fragile to be named just yet, too sacred, perhaps, to be declared out loud. Third, when Christina confronted Michael with a tense warning, the air between them was heavy with urgency. Michael had grown too comfortable in the illusion of control, failing to see the slow unraveling that had already begun. Christina, intuitive and emotionally attuned in ways Michael often dismissed, knew something was coming, and she was right. Shortly after, Willow made a shocking announcement that shook the foundation of every relationship she was clinging to. It wasn't just an update or a casual decision, it was a declaration of liberation. In one moment, Willow severed ties with Drew, not with bitterness but with a clarity born from betrayal. For too long, she had allowed herself to believe in a version of Drew that never existed, one carefully constructed by charm, manipulation, and the facade of stability. But the moment she discovered the truth about him and Nina, that illusion shattered. Willow's discovery was not accidental. It came to her in fragments, whispers, timelines that didn't add up, moments when Nina spoke too cautiously, and Drew acted too familiar. And then it hit her all at once, the truth she hadn't wanted to see. Drew, the man she thought had been her partner in rebuilding her life, had been intimately involved with Nina, the very person who had been a source of heartbreak and betrayal for so long. It wasn't just infidelity of the body, it was emotional treachery, layered and sustained. It was a calculated decision by both of them to keep her in the dark, to withhold the truth under the guise of protection. Willow felt the sharp sting of humiliation and the suffocating weight of deception. The man who had promised her honesty, who had offered himself as a safe place, had instead become the very person who mirrored every abandonment she had ever known. The betrayal cut even deeper because of who was involved. Nina, her mother in name only, had once begged for a second chance, had pleaded to rebuild their relationship brick by fragile brick. But that foundation crumbled in an instant when Willow realized that Nina had chosen silence again. Had chosen to stand behind a man rather than beside her daughter. The fury that followed wasn't loud or explosive, it was cold, final, and absolute. Willow didn't confront them with tears. She simply walked away. She made it known in no uncertain terms, she would never forgive Drew, not for the betrayal, not for the manipulation, and not for the false sense of security he had carefully engineered around her. To her, he was a predator disguised as a savior, and that revelation was unforgivable. The decision to cut ties with Drew wasn't just emotional, it was symbolic. It marked the end of a chapter where Willow allowed others to dictate the terms of her healing. By walking away from Drew, she reclaimed her voice. She refused to be a pawn in anyone's game, be it a mother desperate for redemption or a man desperate for control. It wasn't easy. The emotional toll was immense. There were sleepless nights, echoes of conversations she now saw as scripted, gestures she once saw as love now reinterpreted as strategy. But amid the grief, there was also freedom. For the first time in a long time, Willow could breathe without feeling watched, manipulated, or emotionally blackmailed. As for Nina, the heartbreak was mutual, but not equal. Nina had gambled on the belief that she could compartmentalize. That she could keep Drew in her private world and still preserve her tenuous connection with Willow. But she underestimated Willow's integrity, her need for transparency. When the truth surfaced, it wasn't just the betrayal that ended their relationship, it was the realization that Nina hadn't changed. Despite all the apologies and promises, she was still choosing secrets over honesty. Willow didn't explode. She didn't lash out. She simply said goodbye. It was colder than any fight could have been. It was the sound of a door shutting for good. Willow wasn't interested in hearing explanations or justifications. She didn't want closure. She wanted distance. Finally, Tracy felt the walls closing in, her pride scorched by public humiliation and the ruthless precision with which Drew had orchestrated her downfall. At the nurses' ball, in front of the entire elite of Port Charles, he had dared to accuse her of engineering a drugging scheme involving ketamine. A plot she had nothing to do with, yet one that stained her reputation in a single instant. The whispers in the ballroom, the sharp glances, the murmurs of betrayal had clung to her like a second skin. Drew's accusation hadn't just wounded her socially, it was a calculated strike designed to isolate her, to poison the trust that still lingered around her name within the Quartermaine family. Tracy, a woman who had built her legacy on strategy and control, now found herself positioned as the villain in a narrative she hadn't authored, and that was unforgivable. What Drew failed to calculate, however, was how Tracy reacted when cornered. The more he pushed, the more relentless she became. He had underestimated not only her intelligence, but the searing fire of vengeance that simmered beneath her composed exterior. Tracy wasn't a woman who unraveled, she retaliated. And as Drew continued his smear campaign, inching closer to total influence over ELQ and subtly maneuvering to exile her from the very dynasty she helped preserve, Tracy began to activate the levers of power she had long kept in reserve. She reached out to old allies, quietly unearthing files, financial discrepancies, and personal vulnerabilities that Drew thought buried. If he wanted to play a public game, Tracy was about to introduce him to the art of private destruction. Tracy's retaliation didn't come with fanfare. It began in silence, in the sealed offices of attorneys, in encrypted messages sent across state lines, in conversations held in dark corners of country clubs Drew had never been invited to join. She wasn't just fighting for her name, she was fighting for dominance. For Tracy, this wasn't about family drama anymore. It was about bloodlines, power, and legacy. And as far as she was concerned, Drew had not earned the right to rewrite the Quartermaine story. With every step he took to humiliate her, Tracy countered with a move designed to destabilize his foundation. She began to re-examine every decision he had made since returning to Port Charles, unearthing his connections to offshore accounts, questionable dealings at Aurora, and whispers of backroom agreements that could ignite scandals on Wall Street. It wasn't long before she had enough ammunition to burn him down completely. But Tracy didn't move hastily, she waited for the perfect moment. Her strategy culminated not in a boardroom, but in the quiet aftermath of another one of Drew's manipulative stunts, this time, a public push to have her removed from ELQ's board on the grounds of ethical misconduct. That was the final spark. Within hours, Tracy leaked a curated dossier to high-profile media outlets, implicating Drew in financial irregularities and suggesting that he had leveraged insider information to build a false narrative of her guilt. Within days, federal interest was piqued, and investigations began swirling. Stockholders panicked. Board members grew silent. And Drew found himself suddenly losing control of the narrative he had so carefully manipulated. Behind the scenes, Tracy met with Ned, with Brooke Lynn, even with Olivia. She didn't ask for their forgiveness or allegiance, she presented them with facts, with proof, with the cold truth of Drew's ambition and the danger it posed not only to the Quartermaine legacy, but to the stability of their entire financial empire. Her words carried weight because they were no longer about emotion, they were about survival. And one by one, the tide began to shift. The very people Drew had tried to turn against her began to question his motives. Trust, once weaponized against her, now became her shield. Tracy didn't stop there. She worked with regulators to ensure that Drew's activities came under intense scrutiny. She quietly encouraged whistleblowers to come forward from within Aurora, painting Drew not just as a manipulator, but as a reckless leader whose actions could tank investor confidence and destroy shareholder value. Her moves were surgical, each one designed to fracture his support system until he stood alone. When Drew attempted to fight back, he found his allies abandoning him, his public image crumbling, and his authority evaporating like smoke. By the time he realized how deeply Tracy had embedded herself back into the framework of ELQ, it was already too late.